what does God say love is? What does God say relationship should be? You know, what does God say value is? One of the main reasons that I am a Christian is because I believe in the teaching Imago Dei, which is that we all have inherent dignity because we were made by God, for the purpose of being in a relationship with Him and others.
Hey, friend, I am so excited that you are with us today. I have a special treat for you. Christine is the host of the Holy Shift podcast and is one of my favorite people. And I am so glad that she is here. So I'm going to have her introduce you to what it is she does, who she is, and then we're just going to jump right in. So take it away, my dear friend.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so pumped to be here. You're like, hey, do you want to talk about life? And I'm like, well, we do that all the time. Or there's just going to be like a camera running. Let's do that. So
Exactly.
This is so fun. Thank you for having me on. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, I've got the Holy Shift show, and that's part of a ministry that I have called the Holy Shift. And kind of the purpose of the podcast is just to give people a safe place to ask questions and be curious and be willing to be surprised by God. And we kind of ask some really hard questions about God, about ourselves, about healing. I'm about to start season 3, which is all about learning to live whole and healed. And certainly that's part of what my community has been asking for, but it also is part of what I've been navigating lately. I've been dealing with a holy shift of my own. So just learning how to understand my body better, my mind better, God better, and just exist in this world in a healthier way is kind of going to be the whole premise of season 3. So that's what I've been up to.
That is so exciting. I cannot wait to hear it. And we'll put in the show notes links to everything where people can find you, where the show is, and all of that.
And Dr. Charlie Hornis, highly anxious people pleaser turned master certified professional life coach. Learning to manage my brain was so life-changing for me that I got certified so that I could teach these incredible evidence-based practices to you. Are you ready for massive change? Let's go.
I would like to start off with you telling us the premise of this show.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about, because it's a show based in spirituality and seeking.
Mm-hmm.
What are you seeking? And how does spirituality play into this?
Oh, good question. Okay. So I'm a person of faith, but I didn't grow up that way. And I know C.S. Lewis thinks that he's the most reluctant convert, but I think I'd give him a run for his money. I kind of came to...
Wait, I'm jumping in. Are you saying that you have been dragged kicking and screaming into new levels of joy?
Yeah, I have. And
my favorite quote from Lewis. Sorry, I'm not going to talk over you again, but that one I had to jump in on.
Yeah. Oh, and it's phrased so perfectly. New levels of joy, new levels of peace. But I mean, you don't get there. It's just not like a shiny, happy yellow brick road there. It was a battle for me to get there. And I had a lot of questions coming to faith. I still had a lot of questions after faith, which is part of why I went to seminary. One, I kind of wanted to hope, I was afraid maybe I was accidentally being a heretic and I didn't know. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be talking about Jesus, I might want to know some stuff for sure and not just be going off of what I think I know. So I went for that. But also I am just like a question asker. And I had all these questions myself, and I wanted access to like some of the great thinkers in the world and the resources in the world to ask those questions. And so kind of the premise of the ministry and the premise of the podcast is to give other people a safe place to ask the questions. And I have a very diverse audience. About 40% of my people are what I call Jesus curious. So they're interested in spirituality. They're not necessarily offended by Jesus, but they're not going to church or they've been hurt by church. I know that's a big part of a lot of my audience's stories. And then I've got some people that they're seeking, we're like, I want to know more about love. I want to know who God is. I want to have a better understanding of what He wants for me and from me. And then I've got some people kind of from my old fundamentalist background where I kind of started out. And I'm hoping that I'm shifting the perspective for all of us, and not because I think I have all the answers. Like it's not a Christine show. I have experts come on in different areas, and we kind of like wrangle with and hash through, like, how does this intersect with art? How does this intersect with politics? Like, what are we supposed to think about these things? Or how do we even begin to ask these questions of God and of ourselves? So it's really fun. I'm like forever like putting my foot in my mouth, like according to someone, because of that varied audience, but I love it. I really wanted unlikely community, and I feel like I've got that. So I'm having a good time with it.
I love that you have a space for diversity of thought. So just real quick, you self-identify as Christian?
I do. Yeah, I do. But I've got a lot of folks in my community who aren't real sure about that. And that's okay. Doesn't bother me at all. I actually love to have those conversations.
So there's a safe space there for people that are just like seeking, curious, want to ask questions. Because the thing that I want to make the biggest point about as we start this conversation is, regardless of how we feel about spirituality, faith, religion, whatever words you want to use, we all at milestones in our life ask big questions. Every single one of us. There's not one of us. You can call yourself atheist all day long. You're still asking big questions when it's important, when tragedy strikes, or I don't know, some people, they don't get a job and they're like, why did this happen to me? Or it's a myriad, a spectrum. And I feel like that what you're building right now is a safe place for anybody to talk about the big question.
I hope so. I know that I needed that so much. And part of why I didn't come to faith for so long is because I couldn't find it. So I don't know. I just, I think of myself as somebody who works the door. I'm not forcing anybody in. I think we're all searching. We're all seeking to be healed and whole. And I think I have found the answer for me. And I'm willing to discuss that with anybody who'd like to discuss that. But, I'm not standing at the door telling everybody outside of the door that, that I'm standing at, like, okay, so you're wrong and you're not welcome here if you don't believe. Like, I'm like, hey, come on in, see what you think, check it out. And then I'm reminding people inside the door, and I'm getting this from a fabulous old poem that I love so much. I'm reminding people inside the door real far in, hey, there's people out here, and you need to be cognizant of the questions that people have, the concerns that people have. You can't just go in there and get comfortable and think, that there aren't some really hard things happening in the world and some questions that really deserve, wrangling with. So, I hope I'm doing it well. I'm working really hard at it. I know I fail a lot, I'm sure, but, the safe place was a big, big thing for me. Everybody is welcome. And that's not just with my podcast. I believe that everybody is welcome at the table to experience Jesus, and then they can do with that what they will. Faith is a very, very personal thing. I think it's the biggest question we ever answer. So I think people should take their time with it. I just share what I think I know and what I'm learning and experiencing, and that can resonate with people how they like.
The space that you're creating is fascinating, and I'm excited about it because we don't have enough of these types of spaces for people, I don't think. I would love for you to share anything you're comfortable with sharing about how you came to where you are now and creating this space. Like, why did you do that? And what has shifted for you so far?
Well, when I did first come to faith, I ended up in some pretty fundamentalist circles. So I just assumed that everything everybody was telling me was true and real and right. And I had some questions about some of it, and those questions weren't welcome. And that was really frustrating for me. And looking back now, 25 years into my faith journey, I understand why now. I don't believe that we have a real good idea of what he wants for us and from us. I believe that's a lifelong journey that we're on to figure out, like, who is God and what does it mean to belong to him? What does it mean to live for him? And I think that there's a lot of people out there that are offering some formulas and some pat answers. And I think that that's kind of not helpful to the people who are asking. And certainly, I think it's very limiting in terms of the picture that we're painting of God. And so just giving people a place to come and ask the questions, to permission to be curious, permission to be like surprised by God. I know that the things that I've been learning, especially in the last like 5 years or so, have kind of blown up some of the things I really thought I believed before. And I'm finding that Jesus is so much bigger and better and more wonderful than I could ever imagine. But I had to kind of step outside of the formula a little bit to see that and to experience that. And I'm still a little bit like, oh my, what? This is a little bit disorienting. But again, with the holy shift, I just think that a lot of us have what I call spiritual vertigo, which is what we think we know we might have upside down. And so I just want to kind of like pull back all the things we're told we have to believe and just ask the questions of the actual person of Jesus.
What are some of the big aha moments that you've had over this journey when it comes to your faith?
I think there has been two. The first one is I spent the first probably 15 years of my life following the formula I had been given to grow closer with the Lord. And I had a close relationship with him, but certainly something was missing. And I had observed that there were some things, some inconsistencies, we'll say, with the things we were being taught, and then the ways that we were actually, like some of us were actually expected to live them out and other people were not. And when I began to ask the questions, I began to find out, it's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz when you pull the curtain back and you find out, that the man behind the curtain isn't all the show and blow that he's showing up, behind the pulpit sometimes. And it kind of caused me to kind of go back and start at the beginning. Like, what do I know? Or what do I think I know? What do I actually believe? And kind of rebuild faith. So I have a lot of empathy for people who are deconstructing or have deconstructed. I kind of did I would call a mini deconstruction, because I think in the back of my mind, I was asking a lot of those questions all along and just wasn't giving myself permission to admit. So I kind of deconstructed and then have been reconstructing. And so that's why I'm not offended by people's questions, because I've been plagued with them my whole life.
What about those that insist that we have to just have a childlike faith and believe whatever we're told?
Well, I think we can have a childlike faith when we actually know God. We can have a childlike enjoyment and delight in God. But a childlike faith, I don't think that's reserved for pastors. I think that's a delight that we have in the actual Lord. Like, there are some really great churches out there and some really great pastors out there, but they're human. And there are some really terrible ones out there, and we have to be very discerning. So I think the childlike faith is like a childlike delight and trust that comes when we're actually in relationship with God, or actually we're just seeking him and knowing that our questions are welcome. He invites our questions. So for people who are afraid that they're not allowed to be mad at God or ask questions of God, or they think they can only do that in a church setting, there's some really great churches out there, I'm sure, that can help you do that. But our relationship with God should be a personal one. And I don't know that we take all of our childlike faith and invest that in a pastor or a specific church. I think that we ask God, hey, I want to know who you are. Would you reveal yourself to me? And I'm going to have childlike faith that you'll do that, and that I'll, learn more about you.
Would you say that faith is different than religion?
Yes. Yeah. The pat answer that they always give, which is kind of a cliche to say, but I do believe it, is that faith is not about religion. It's about relationship. And I know that just sounds like something we're going to stick on an Instagram post, but that also, I think, is the truth of actual faith. Religion is like a set of rules and a formula to follow. But formulas aren't going to get us to God. Trust me. I tried to get him in an Excel spreadsheet, and he was like, I'm not going to be color coded. I do not fit there. What kind of God fits on a spreadsheet? If God is who he says he is, at least in the Christian understanding, then he came for relationship and the redemption of relationship. So when we put together programs and formulas, and listen, there are great programs out there, and there are guidelines to follow or outlines that might be helpful to us in spiritual practice. But the answer is not the formula. God is not in the formula. God, he's so much bigger than that. And that's, I think, the biggest holy shift that I have experienced lately is I thought I had a pretty good idea of like how God viewed certain things, suffering, marriage, hardship, that kind of thing. And then when I went to write my final research paper on suffering, I had to throw a lot of that out the window and be like, well, that is not what he said. Okay. And then certainly like with the recent implosion of my own personal life, I had to get alone with God and throw out the formula and be like, okay, I think I've believed some things that weren't true and that were really harmful to me. And I want to know who you are and what you say about what I'm going through. And that's why I say I'm all in, because he showed up. He showed up. The joy and the peace that is bringing, even in the midst of this really hard season, has just been astounding. I wouldn't trade that for the world.
We're supposed to follow the rules, and then we're supposed to get what we want, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying with the formula?
That is a very simplified summary of the formula I was given in my early years of faith. Yes. And so just kind of like throwing that out and being like, okay, no. What does God say love is? What does God say relationship should be? What does God say value is? One of the main reasons that I am a Christian is because I believe in the teaching Imago Dei, which is that we all have inherent dignity because we were made by God, for the purpose of being in a relationship with him and others. So that means that my dignity is no more or less than a woman on the other side of the world or than a man. But in certain circles, that is not necessarily the belief, and people might represent that it is. But the posture is always the tell, and there really kind of is much more of a hierarchy of dignity that is awarded to people based on race or sex or wealth or whatever else, and that in no way aligns with the heart of God. That's when you see me get a little feisty and pit bully when people will bring up like Christian nationalism or like oppressive patriarchal systems and be like, and this is God's will. And I'm like, oh, no, don't make me tempt the table. No, it ain't. Let's look at it and let's see what his heart really says about women and about minorities and about the vulnerable, because it isn't really the current American representation.
Amen. Are you sure you're not going to go get ordained to become a preacher? Because I really think you should.
Well, I don't think so, because part of what I want to do is, and again, I don't want it to sound like I know I have all the answers, because I don't think I do, Charlie. I think I'm still getting all kinds of things wrong. Part of what I do, I keep it separate from the church so that it can be critical of the church when it needs to be. And again, not to say, oh, because I've got it right and quote unquote, the church has it wrong, but because I'm aware that as much as I am a lover of the local church, I'm happy that I've now part of a safe and loving church. That has not always been my experience. And when there is not a safe place in church or people haven't found a good one, I want them to have somewhere else to go. And I want to be able to say, hey guys, I'm not sure we're getting this right. When I started this ministry, there were lots of things going on in the world that I won't be specific about, and I was very upset about it. And within my home, there was an enormous divide on how we saw these things. And my now ex-husband came down the stairs, and I was just like pretty much in fetal position, bawling my brains out on the floor. And he's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "We're getting it wrong." And I just can't imagine how it grieves the heart of God to know that we're using his name to harm people. And I'm not okay with that, basically. And not to say I haven't done it. I'm sure I have. I can think of 2 people I've had to go back and apologize for kind of pushing some of those like more fundamentalist teachings onto other women, 2 girls that I counseled, accordingly. And I've gone back to them and say, I was wrong about that. And I'm so sorry. for any harm I caused, I was teaching you what I'd been taught. And I know now that isn't God's heart for us. And I'm getting better and better at looking at the world and saying that doesn't look like him at all. As the Bible says that women are to submit to their husbands, then we also need to talk about, as you were talking about, like that men are to die for their wives like Jesus died for the church. Like it is that kind of sacrificial love. So, kind of the joke.
How many people know that part of the quote? Raise your hand.
Nobody knows that part. Yeah, nobody knows that part. And nobody knows that what Paul was really teaching there is that submission should be mutual, which was just blowing the lid off of like the patriarchal culture that he was speaking to. I mean, I used to think that Paul was a total misogynist and used to just be like, oh, about him. And I am finding out now that he was actually such a champion of women and was just, lighting fires here and there and blowing it all up and undoing all of that. But the way that it often trickles down, the trickle down theology in some of the churches these days, especially in the more like fundamentalist circles, is still like this hierarchy. And it's like, well, you have to submit to your husband. And I'm like, okay, but what does the rest of that say? So, a fuller study of scripture shows that there's this mutuality, that there's this love and honor. And if for those who do believe there's supposed to be some hierarchy, like the joke's a little bit on them, like, if there's a hierarchy, it's the husband who has the power in society that's supposed to put himself beneath the wife and bring her up. It's the opposite of the way that's being applied. So that has been a big thing. So for me, as part of my healing journey, I just had to accept reality for the situation that I was dealing with. I had to be able to tell myself the truth about the situation that I was in. And I had to be able to find safe people that I could also tell the truth to that weren't going to tell me, hey, you're at fault somehow, go home and you fix it. And then I had to get myself educated on, what love really should look like, what mutuality is supposed to look like, because that wasn't something that I'd grown up seeing or had experienced thus far. And I think what happens a lot of times, at least in the circles that I'm running in now, which is a lot of women healing from some of the things that I'm healing from, we get stuck in that education cycle. And I'm such a huge fan of it. You know that I like accumulate master's degrees like as a hobby. So I love this. This is so my vibe. Sometimes we think like the education is the healing and education is a catalyst. But sometimes I think we like gather the information and we think, well, now I know better. But we're holistic people. The healing actually has to go a whole lot deeper. We have to kind of, for those of us who grew up in dynamics that maybe didn't teach us the best ways to interrelate, and it was like no surprise that we ended up in marriages that were harmful or unhealthy. We have to do a lot of deprogramming to really understand, like, what does love look like? What are God's expectations of me? What are God's actual promises for me? And the formulas, I think, are designed to give people easy answers and also make people feel safe. Not like, but we're not here to make people feel safe. Like we're here to seek God and seek wholeness. So the thing that I had to realize about what I had learned, I had to untangle a lot of the messaging that I had received my whole life. Some of it in my, family, some of it with my early church experiences, where I had been taught that kindness meant like eliminating tension or discomfort for anybody else, that grace meant like punting truth if I had to, keeping secrets and staying quiet and getting smaller. If we have been brought up in systems where we've accidentally been enabling bad behavior in people, that doesn't mean that we caused abuse or that we deserve abuse or now we're responsible to undo that. That's not how that works. As individuals, we are all responsible for ourselves. We can look at ways that we may have accidentally been enabling, because we kind of enable what we tolerate, right? So we can look at ways like we may have tolerated some things and enabled some things that now we know are not in line with love. But that doesn't mean that we're at fault, that we're responsible, that we're to blame. The abuser is still the abuser, and the abuser needs to be held accountable for that.
I've got a place now where I can put everybody's resources in one storefront. What's really cool is when you use
the what we call affiliate links. And I'm now becoming an affiliate for a whole bunch of different things. It's all on my website at charliehornesscoaching.com. And it's on the bonus resources page. What happens is when you purchase something off of that, a portion of it goes back to the show. And so what you're doing basically when you buy from there is you're supporting the show at no additional cost to you, which is kind of like the coolest thing ever. It's going to help us continue to create content for you and bring on incredible guests that are, they blow my mind. So I'm hoping they will blow your mind too, whether it's metaphysics and psychology and theology or high fantasy romance. You're going to find your next favorite read right there. Let's go.
And when we follow the formula, if we're honest with ourselves, we are following it because we want to be closer to God, but also because we want to be safe, because we want the dream, because we really, on some level, all kind of want a God that we can rub out of the lamp and get what we want. And the problem is God is not that God. He is sovereign. He is safe. He is good, but he isn't safe. I love, again, going back to C.S. Lewis, in Chronicles of Narnia and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we're like, well, of course he's good, but he isn't safe, but he's good. And those are two very different things. And so sometimes we think good means safe in terms of and there will never be any suffering and I will get everything that I want. And that's not what God promises at all. When I wrote my final paper on suffering, that was a whole tump it over, and kind of dig my way through that rubble. Because again, with the following the formula. So for me, a book that was very, very helpful to me was, The Reason for God, by Tim Keller. And then more recently, what kind of blew the lid off of my dynamics.
My progressive women, calm down. She said, Tim Keller, you won't die.
Yeah.
Let's listen to what she has to say. It's okay.
It's okay. And listen, I don't agree with everything that Keller says, but he's got some, for those who kind of left brain logic arguments on suffering, he's got some nuggets in there that are really super helpful. And then on a more recent level, when it comes to what does love look like? What does goodness look like? What actually kind of yanked my eyes wide open, with my situation was a church called Tove by Scott McKnight. And he's definitely on the more progressive side. Tove meaning good, in the original Hebrew in Genesis, when God made everything and it was good. And in that book, he and Laura are unpacking this is what an abusive dynamic looks like in a church. In a church, it should be good. It should be tov. It should be safe. And for me, I wasn't yet able or willing to recognize some of the dynamics I was in if they were being applied to me. But picking those, basically they listed out this is what abuse looks like. These are the tactics that an abuser uses. And because it was separate from me and I was doing research on spiritual abuse, I was removed enough from it that I was able to recognize myself in the story. And I, was like, oh my gosh, this thing I'm experiencing is called something. And it isn't just hard. And it isn't just that I'm, not good at it. So I went the next day to my old counselor at a church that typically wasn't very safe, but this particular counselor was. And I told the truth. And they put me in trauma care pretty immediately. But I'll tell you, Charlie, when I had to start to accept the reality of the situations that I was in relationally and spiritually, the grief was unbelievable. Because the thing about taking all the responsibility is, as long as you think it's all your fault, you still feel like you can change it. And when you find out that it isn't all you and it isn't yours to change, we can cooperate, we can be a part of it. When you find out that it isn't your fault, you lose all the power too. And then the grief comes, because I knew then, I was the only one holding this together. So, it was a hard awakening. I'm devastated by it, but I'm not sorry for it, because I really am, I think, coming to a place where I have a much fuller understanding of who God is, of who I am, and of what love looks like now.
Many biblical scholars say that the first 3 centuries of Christianity had significant amounts of women in leadership and,
Mhm.
very egalitarian to men, if not more so. And I recently, when I was doing research on my dissertation, I came across an old quote that I'd heard before, but hadn't thought about in forever. It was either uh, Fiorenza or Ruther, one of those really cool, incredible, life changing women theologians. And, they said, no one's ever asked the question, why were the women acting up so bad in Paul?
Oh, I know.
Like,
They were mad.
yeah,
You got to ask that question. Yeah.
why? Why
Yeah.
did anybody care? Why did something changed? And
Yeah.
it was so important that he wrote about it, telling them to
Yeah.
calm down. Like
What happened?
he didn't just out of nowhere, all the women were just like, they were being kind and listening and submissive. And he was like, oh, and by the way, like he had way more important things to talk about. And
Yeah.
so when they were doing this sort of reconstruction, I forget the term of the theological lens, but when they were doing the reconstruction, they said, well, they thought Jesus was returning immediately. And they knew that being a woman was not safe. Childbirth was not safe. Marriage was not
Mhm.
safe. And they
Mhm.
all started leaving husbands and, there were no conjugal beds anymore. And the men got pissed. And that's
Yeah.
why Paul intervened, because of the
Yeah.
pressure. And what I'm leading with those 2 points is at the end of the day, when the change in the 3rd century happened, it became about power. And when you gave the first 2 points before, all I could think of, there's a third one. There's a third one. It's also about power and keeping people in their place. Because the
The whole
moment
Yeah.
that you don't get what you're supposed to get that you were promised, right? With your tithing and all this stuff and volunteering and giving, when something happens, because we're a creature and we were dying from the moment we were born, and there's no prayer that's going to keep that from happening.
Mhm.
The moment the tragedy happens, which it's coming for everybody, it's different for everybody, but something is coming for all of us that we are going to have to deal with as humans. And the
Mhm.
moment that happens and it no longer tracks with the theology, it's so much easier to throw away the individual as disposable and did it wrong than actually address the fact that theology sucks. It's great
Yeah.
until you have something bad happen to you. And I'm not being judgmental. You can think that all day long, and God bless you if you do. But when something happens, which it inevitably will, that theology is not going to help. And anyone
Yeah.
who taught you that theology is not going to help, because now your experience negates that belief, because both
Mhm.
cannot exist.
Again, if we're being taught that God can be reached formulaically, we're cheapening who he is. And then we're wondering, like, and then you add all the hurt and the hypocrisy in the church. And then people are like, I don't know, all these people are deconstructing. They just don't want God. I'm like, no. They just don't want your version of God. I think people do want faith. I think it's built in. Honestly, that's my belief, is that it's just built in that we know there's something bigger than us and that we're yearning to know more about that. But people are calling BS on things that don't align. And listen, there are some theologies that I believe in that are really, really, really hard, that I resent, honestly. Like, I'm like, that is not at all convenient for what I'd like to see and do. But they're still true, but they have to be, like, it has to be true of everyone. It has to be true on the mountain and in the valley. I think God is the God of the valley. That's where I have found it. And I resent that too. I really would have liked like a more mountaintop experience with Jesus all the time. But, I've got God of the valley. And I mean, that comfort has been amazing to me, but it has cost me dearly. But he's worth everything to me. But so I want to, 2 points. Like, I want to a quick point on what you said about, what we're finding out theologically now. So the beautiful thing about women now having access to theology and being able to go and study is the stories that have been misinterpreted, that were being misapplied from behind the pulpit, that have been misresearched or misunderstood. Now we have women theologians that are and there are some men out there that are doing a good job too, but we have female theologians that are just brilliant, these brilliant thinkers that are going back through and being able to look at the text, and they have access to all of the wonderful information. And they're like, no, that is not what he has said. And so a lot of what Paul, one of my favorite professors, Dr. Sandra Glahn, has a new book about the Timothy text that you were talking about called Nobody's Mother, and how the cultural Artemis worship was a big part of shaping what Paul was even saying, right? And nobody had even paid attention to any of that. Nobody had ever had to put themselves in a woman's shoes and be like, why do they not want to give birth? Why are they not wanting to get married? What's happening here? And because there were no women at the table discussing that, no one could really get a good notch on hey, I bet something like this might have been happening. What do we know about culture at the time for that? So that's one fun thing. And there's some really great female theologians out there that are just wholly shifting it, just getting it done. I love it so much. And I got to spend all last semester.
Verb.
Yes, it is.
Right now, you coined it. We are wholly shifting it.
We are wholly shifting it. And all last semester got to study that, and I still have a lot of stuff I'm learning on that. But that was a big thing for me. Formula also is how we get the money to build buildings and build these huge ministries. And I'm very anti celebrity Christianity as well. I can go off on, that's a whole soapbox I could get on a different time. But the thing about power is this. So power has always been the battle, I think, since the beginning. And we have to understand that sometimes people benefit from our brokenness. So there are people out there, we want to live healed and whole, but there are people out there who do not want that for us because they are benefiting in some way from our brokenness. And whether this is relationally, our family of origin, our workspaces, our worship places, wherever this dynamic is, often it's the women, very often it's the women who are the first to wake up, the first to smell the smoke, the first to sound the alarm on destructive dynamics. And sadly, that's mostly because we're the victim of it, or another vulnerable population like children, they're the victim of it. And, we are often the shepherds and the safeguards for those people. And it can be very devastating and disillusioning to find out, when we sound the alarm, that there are some people who are not willing to respond. There are some people who are not willing to listen. There are a variety of reasons why some people are not willing to listen when we sound the alarm. But the hardest, most devastating part, and this has been part of my journey, and it's a big part of a lot of the people in my community's journey, and maybe yours as well. The hardest thing is when we discover that some of the people that we love and trust the most are not willing to come to our rescue because they're too busy warming their hands by the fire. They are benefiting in some way from our brokenness. And that is a really hard thing to know. But it's in accepting that and realizing that, and not taking responsibility for that and for them, that we can really begin to seek truth for ourselves, to heal for ourselves, and discover a truer version of God or of love or whatever, the destructive dynamic has destroyed.